Last Saturday morning, I arrived at the Torrance Farmers Market, and I carried our canopy that you see outside and our brochures and our banners and, of course, our rainbow flags. And I parked at the Torrance Farmers Market, and I pulled everything out of my car, and I walked over to our usual spot. And as I got closer, I noticed a booth already set up, right next to where I'd be spending the next several hours. And in an instant, my heart sank. The booth was decorated with symbols. I won't tell you who it was, but you can guess. The booth was decorated with symbols and slogans that ran counter to almost everything that we stand for. Counter to the values of dignity and inclusion and compassion that we proclaim as a congregation. This booth, they featured a cardboard cutout of a public figure known for open, unabashed racism and misogyny. Big cardboard cutout. You could stand and take a picture next to him. And their table was covered with handouts portraying immigrants as criminals. Bright red signs called for restrictions on voting rights. The whole thing felt like an assault of fear-based messaging, right next to my booth. And then this is the part that complicates the story. They were very friendly. Yeah. One of the women, even, she stepped over to help me adjust that big awning. Can I help you open this up? Okay. I hadn't set up yet. And she did it with this pleasant smile, and I found myself hoping that her kindness was just her kindness, and not because she hadn't yet figured out who I represented. I cynically wondered how long that friendliness would last once our rainbow pride flags were unfurled. As I began arranging our booth, stringing up those pride flags and placing the everyone is welcome materials prominently on the tables, those things that you see out there felt suddenly less like decoration and more like a force field of sorts, a protective boundary between our values and theirs, even though there are many that overlap. It felt like a spiritual perimeter made out of color, made out of fabric. So during those many hours I spent sitting beside them, I kept feeling questions rise in my throat. Questions about gun deaths, questions about bodily autonomy that I wanted to ask them, questions about who gets to claim patriotism and why. There was a lot of flags. One of the women wore a flag shirt that said pray. Question who gets to claim religion and why. Questions about civil rights, about the history of racism in this country, about immigration and labor, and who carries the real burden in this society. I wanted to remind them that nearly every booth around us in that farmer's market was run by brown-skinned families selling produce grown through the sweat of their own labor, back-breaking labor. Labor that makes that our local Torrance Farmers Market possible. And it facilitates the other group's free booth and captive audience, making their political messages painfully ironic. I wanted to ask those questions. I didn't. I smiled, I nodded politely, and I returned to my seat. And in that moment, I noticed something in myself. Grace was becoming very difficult for me to access, much harder for me to access. Harder to practice, harder to believe in. I was just fuming. And I find myself more and more these days, as I imagine you do, tempted to just forego grace. I look around and see freedoms being chipped away, systems being weakened, rights being politicized, compassion being mocked, and whole communities treated as disposable. It becomes easy It becomes too easy to feel that grace is something that we should withhold until the world behaves better, like a punishment. As if grace must be earned by the outside world before we can offer it from within. Let me be clear, though, the women in that booth next to me are not the source of this societal decay and danger that I'm talking about. They are my fellow humans. They are at worst misguided or misled. They are at best, they are good-hearted people responding to a narrative that they've been taught to trust. The rot, it comes from the systems and the leaders and the machinery of propaganda that manipulates fear and exploits longing. It comes from the powers that benefit when neighbors distrust one another. That helps those powers. When communities fracture, they benefit. When empathy is silenced, the people at that booth are not the problem. They are in many ways also the very victims of the problem. Still, their proximity made it hard for me to remember grace. I started thinking more just then about how grace is considered something that I said that can be postponed until things get better, until repair arrives, until society improves, until democracy steadies itself, until justice feels more secure, as though grace is just a luxury for peaceful times. And I realized that grace is actually never more necessary than in the moments when it feels most scarce. Grace is not the reward for repair. It is the raw material that makes repair possible. Grace is not what flowers in the fullness of a bloom. It is what incubates in the compost of despair. Grace is the thread that runs through that entire cycle that I talked about in the reading. Growth and decay and death and rebirth. Runs through that entire cycle. And our task is not to wait for the graceful seasons. Our task is to enlarge our capacity to offer and experience grace in every season of the cycle. The service description today suggested that we might consider how to extend times of peace and times of grace. And on the surface, that sounds like a question about how can we prolong the good times in between the bad times? How to stretch out the periods when life feels at least manageable, when it feels somewhat fair, or harmonious and kind. How can we stretch out those times? But that question is built on a false assumption. The one I've been talking about, that grace only exists in the better moments of the cycle. In actuality, extending times of peace is not about prolonging peace itself, but about discovering grace even when things look nothing like peace at all. What if grace is not a season, but a stance? Whenever I need help understanding life cycles, I turn to nature. The artist Mary Louise Bantel paints what she calls the beauty of decay. Look it up if you haven't seen it. And she captures flowers, not in their moment of perfect bloom, but in their curling and in their browning and in their drooping stages. The petals are thinning and the leaves are folding and the color is draining. Yet somehow, these images are often more arresting, more moving, even more beautiful than pictures of the same flowers at their peak. Decay can be beautiful. The botanical gardens here in the South Bay show this vividly. Walk any path there and you will see fallen branches, decomposing leaves, and tree trunks hollowed from the inside. And notice just how stunning they are. They renew our spirits rather than diminish them. And the very soil beneath our feet is a cathedral of rot. It's a holy amalgam of everything that once lived, but now nourishes new life. The other day, some of the preschool kids, I love being here during the days because I interact with the preschool kids, gave me some of these fallen leaves that have these such amazing gradients of color on them. This is what it looks like in the Midwest. So, in the Midwest where I grew up, fall was the season we look forward to all year because of this explosion of color, because of the fiery brilliance of the trees preparing to let go of their leaves, preparing for their leaves to die. It is beauty found in death and spiritual uplift found in the knowledge that the leaves return to the earth so new life can emerge. Nature is full of such reminders. Detritivores, scavengers, saprophytes are not just cool-sounding words that I Googled. They're names for creatures whose entire purpose is to transform death into life. Fungi that turn dead trees into nutrient-rich soil. Vultures that clean what would otherwise become disease. Microorganisms that decompose our leftovers into fertilizer. Decay is not a flaw, it is a feature. Without it, life would collapse, and humans are no different. Societies break down so that they can rebuild. Beliefs die so new wisdom can grow. Even our personal spirits undergo this cycle. Old habits crack open, identities evolve. What we once believed with full confidence sometimes just falls away, making space for new understanding. Earlier this year, at my mother's funeral, even as we were memorializing her, I received a text. A friend sharing the news. Just right during the funeral, I got this text. A friend shared the news that her long-awaited IVF pregnancy had resulted in the birth of her son, born the same week that we buried my mother. A child arrived as my mother departed. The timing, it wasn't mystical, but it was so meaningful. Not because I imagined reincarnation and that my mother would be reborn as a little boy. Okay, I didn't hear that before it came out. But because I understood deeply and suddenly that when I meet this baby, and I have met this baby, the parts of my mother that live in me will greet him too. It will be life from her flowing forward to him through me, grace traveling through generations. And religions across the world recognize this rhythm. Buddhism teaches of impermanence and renewal, how destruction and creation are intertwined. The Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi, which I talked about actually last year in a sermon, invites us to appreciate decay for its beauty. Imperfect, the weathered, the scarred. It helps us see age and see change and see damage not as failures, but as evidence of life lived fully. Unitarian Universalism also embraces this truth. Our faith is forever in revision, which can be infuriating sometimes, but it's forever in conversation with the present moment. It's so important. We do not cling to doctrine here. We cultivate wisdom. We shed old understandings in order to live into deeper truth. We allow our faith to decompose and recompose as the world demands. But practicing grace in the midst of decay is not simple. I must acknowledge my own privilege here. It is not my place to tell someone living in extreme suffering, for instance, or someone targeted, oppressed, traumatized, marginalized, to just find grace. That's not my place. Grace is not something we impose upon others, nor is it a moral requirement. It is something that we hope becomes available to everybody. But we cannot prescribe necessarily how or when. Still, grace does appear. It appears unexpectedly. It appears unpredictably, sometimes quietly. At that farmer's market, grace actually came right after we set up, in the form of another woman who approached our booth shortly just after I settled into my seat, as I was sort of seething. And this other woman came up to our booth. She shared with me, with tears forming in her eyes, that she had recently lost a close friend who was trans. She seemed surprised to see our booth, as if she hadn't expected to encounter at the farmer's market a space of affirmation. And she was relieved to find us right next to a booth promoting the very ideologies that harm people like her friend. And this felt like an instance of grace. The encounter didn't erase the frustration I felt sitting next to the other booth, but it shifted something. It reminded me that grace often emerges in the same spaces where despair lurks. It reminded me that the work is not to eliminate the struggle, but to represent the hope within it, within the struggle. And so I fear not. I fear not because the world is fine, far from it, but because grace has a stubborn way of reappearing even when I feel I've lost the thread. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote this: "Grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness, when despair destroys all joy and courage." Tillich reminds us that grace is not always the sunlight on a clear day. It is often the candle that flickers when the power goes out. It is not always the calm water. It is often the hand that reaches out when we're drowning. And I want to close with words of a prayer of sorts that I wrote for a sermon last year when I talked about kintsugi, which is the wabi-sabi art of repairing broken pottery with gold so that the cracks themselves become part of the beauty. What I wrote last year was, may we recognize the awesomeness of life's figurative patina, the irregular markings, the weathered colors, the scars that tell our stories. May we embrace these cracks and imperfections as wondrous signs of survival and of transformation. And may we gather up our shattered pieces and mend them with intention and return them to the world as something strong, something new, and something filled with grace. May it be so. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.